Welcome to the Friends of the Earth Ireland System Change webinar series. This aims to facilitate learners to connect the dots between global justice issues, draw out the root causes of injustice, and reflect on action pathways, while also amplifying the work being done by groups locally and around the world. Today we're focusing on gender justice with Katherina Habersbrunner and Lidija Živčič. Katherina is a board member and team leader for sustainable energy and climate solutions at Women Engage for a Common Future, that's WECF, an international NGO striving for sustainable and gender just environmental solutions. WECF's climate and energy programs include projects in Africa, Central Asia and Europe. Increasing gender equality is central to the energy and climate projects, with gender mainstreaming as one of the core tools. Katherina holds a diploma in mathematics, a master's degree in education and psychology, and an MBA in sustainability management with a focus on renewable energy. Lidija is a senior expert at Focus Association for Sustainable Development in Ljubljana, Slovenia. She covers topics of sustainable development, climate, energy, transport, consumption, and degrowth. She has over 20 years of experience in managing projects at the level of Slovenia and EU, and is also experienced in policy work and campaigning. She completed a master's in environmental science and policy at Central European University in Budapest and a PhD at Biotechnical Faculty, University of Ljubljana. I'll now pass over to Katherina and Lidija for a presentation, which will be followed by our short Q&A. Thank you very much, Katherina and Lidija.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for the introduction, and thank you for having us here. So to talk about the topic on gender and energy poverty in particular. And yeah, so I will share my screen now. And yeah. So, can you see it? Yeah, super. Okay, so the topic is energy poverty through a gender lens. And so we have also some intro on overall climate and gender climate, energy and gender, and energy poverty and gender. Just as an introduction, I guess. So normally I experience a lot of Irish activists as very interested in experience with gender, for example. So I'm very happy really to be here to give input for this webinar and on this very important topic. And so just to give a very brief overview about the gender gaps and the impact on the climate change. And I only wanted to show you that we have this very big gender gaps we are aware of. And I focus here, for example, on poverty, where we see all over the world and also in Europe that women are more affected by poverty than men. It was now reinforced by the COVID crisis, for example. So that's one point. So you are more vulnerable, for example, for the impact of climate change. And also a second point is governance. So we see much less women in decision-making positions on all levels. So on UN level, on European level, on Europe level, also, for example, ministries of economy, of energy, of environment. And a third point, for example, is land. So for climate protection, so one important instrument is the energy transition. For energy transition, so we need access to land, access to buildings. And just two numbers, for example, we see that in the Netherlands, just 6% of women are owning agricultural land. In Austria, it's about 32%, so it's the highest share in the European member states. So, and this is this big gender gaps. They have a high impact on climate change, and they increase the vulnerability. And yeah, for example, for displacement, which is a very, very current issue, so more than 80% of the displaced people are women and children, for example. So that's a very broad overview about the gender gaps for the impacts on climate change. And as we also know, is so the causes of the climate change. So we have individual carbon footprints. We have to include intersectionality. It's not only the gender, it's also the fact where you live in the global north, in the global south. It's really multi-layered. It depends on the income, on your financial means, on the access to education, overall, on your social status. And so the consumption patterns, so they reveal gendered differences. For example, which means do we use for transport? How do we choose our nutrition, our alimentations of food and other goods, for example. So it means overall regarding the statistics, so having the focus on gender, so women statistically contribute less to the global warming, but they have less means to adapt and to mitigate the climate change. And so regarding our topic today, so one very important project instrument to face the global warming is the energy transformation, the energy transition. So it's not only a transformation of technologies from fossils and nuclear to renewables. It's also hopefully a system change from a centralized energy to a decentralized energy where the people have much more say in terms of prosumers to produce and to consume energy, in terms of being members of energy communities, where we show later on an example, in terms of being active on local level with communities, for example. And this potential needs to be used for a socially and gender just transformation, but we know it's not. So it's we have to strive for it and to implement instruments that we have really a gender and socially just energy transformation, and not to reinforce the power imbalances what we see in the energy sector so far. And what needs to be considered here for a gender and socially just energy transformation. So here I show you different gender dimensions of energy, which needs to be considered on policy level, on company level, on project level, for example. Because for many people, it's very important to have a higher female share, for example, in the workforce, in the productive work, which is really super important. We see that we have more women working in the renewable energy sector, but still a lot of women are in the administrative units, not in the technological units, for example. That's very important. So to make the sector more interesting for women, to have STEM programs, etc. That's very important. But we have to see that, for example, the women, they take over the high workload of the reproductive work, so the high share of care work, of unpaid care work. So women have a higher number of hours they are working in the households, caring for elderly people, for the children, for family members, for example. And this needs to be considered, because that comes that people that women do not have time. They are facing time poverty, for example. And here also we need a system change, and we need to consider this, for example, for working conditions. We also see for the public services and infrastructure that we do not have a gender just concepts, for example, access to mobility, access to energy. So regarding mobility, so we see highly gendered patterns of mobility, because it depends how you work, where you work. Do you have short ways? Do you have ways to the baby crash? Do you accompany people, for example? So this needs to be included into the infrastructural planning of mobility, for example. It's also for programs for renewable energy. An example of Germany is we have our very nice and successful Renewable Energy Act. So with the feed-in tariff, it's really a success story, but we see who is benefiting from the program, and most people who own buildings, for example, they are benefiting from the program, and so the majority is male. And I think that needs to be considered. So we have to include gender budgeting. And also a very recent example is of the German government for mobility in the Corona crisis for electromobility. It's also a nice program, but also about 80% of men are benefiting because they buy more expensive cars, they have more business cars, they are driving more with individual transport, for example. And this is very important to include in all the infrastructural planning. Also body and health, so to see the differences, to see the higher vulnerability of pregnancy, for example, of the sensitivity of temperature. That's also a very important point. And of course, decision making. I mentioned it beforehand. So who is deciding on energy policy, on social policy? So here also to have more women in the decision-making process, but also so not only to have more women or to have a good gender balance, but it's also to have people with gender expertise. So that's very important. So to train the decision makers on arguments on gender with data, so to show the relevance of to plan and to implement gender just policies. And overall, it's our androcentristic world we are in. So it's that needs to be changed. That's very difficult, for example, in the energy sector, where we have seen the last 200 years a very male-centered energy world. And for example, asking people, are you aware about gender? Do you perceive gender-related gaps and differences? And here, for example, 75% of the women answer yes, and 40% of the men answered yes. So it's really, so what do we perceive? Do we anyhow perceive gender gaps, power imbalances? And here, I think that's our androcentristic world, where the male approach is the norm, and others is the deviation. So I think, and we see that because we for this we still would need a lot of data, and that's a very important requirement to have gender and sex disaggregated data. Just here to show what would be the impact of more gender just and also socially just energy concept. So we would really reduce inequalities, the structural, the financial, the personal barriers. The second argument, so that's a very important argument. So it's to include, to have gender just approaches is really to have more power, to have more people, to have more expertise, to have more engagement. And we can't afford not to the gap of not including gender in energy and climate and also social policies. Of course, we see a higher participation. It means a higher acceptance and trust. And we know from studies that gender just climate and energy policies, they lead to more sustainable measures overall. So in some countries like Sweden, like Canada, for example, and also that gender just energy projects, they are more effective and they have a higher outreach. And this leads overall to a transformation with less poverty, less energy poverty, with gender equality, with decent jobs, with energy transformation and climate protection. So it's not only in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 7, renewable energy. So it's overall a sustainable and just transformation. And here I hand over to Lidija.
Thank you, Katharina. Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize, but it seems that my camera still does not want to work really. So I'm going to just be a voice and not the picture, I'm afraid. Anyhow, I wanted to first speak about energy poverty and gender, how those two perspectives are interconnected. Namely, it is increasing body of evidence shows that women are disproportionately affected by energy poverty. When I say energy poverty, I mean a situation when a person cannot access the necessary basic energy services, not necessarily only from the individual perspective, but also from the socially necessitated perspective. For example, people in energy poverty can face situations such as not being able to heat or cool their place properly. They're facing situations where they have to choose between heating and eating, as it's commonly said. So between heating and some other basic services or basic goods. It can also mean a situation that you cannot invite your friends over because your flat is too cold and it stinks too much of humidity, which is the kind of social perspective of energy poverty, which leads into marginalization and estrangement of people. Anyhow, to go back to energy poverty and gender, as I said, women tend to be more affected by energy poverty than men, and this is mainly due to at least 4 different factors or dimensions. One is the physiological dimension. It's discussed that women tend to be more heat and cold sensitive than men. Also, the way that women, that we like to control temperature and control the heating or cooling is different from the way the men do it. So like there's this simply physiological differences that make energy poverty stronger for women than for men. Then there's the economic dimension, as Katharina already mentioned in several different occasions. Women tend to earn less. There's a gender pay gap. There's also gender pension gap, especially elder women tend to have lower incomes than elderly men. There's also less career advancement opportunities among women than among men. And this is making the economic factor influencing the energy poverty a bit stronger. Then we have the health dimension. Women seem to be more vulnerable to winter mortality, and they're definitely more vulnerable for the mental stress, especially also because they need to take care of their children. And for example, if you cannot pay a heating bill and your child is likely to be cold, this is causing more distress than it could happen with men. Then the last is the social or the cultural dimension. As Katharina also said several times, women tend to take over the disproportionate share of care work, which means that very often they're also more time at home. And if this home is not heated or cooled properly, then energy poverty is a bit stronger factor for women than for men. Also, they're often responsible for the household's energy consumption, but they do not have an equal voice in all the decisions that are made around energy, like which supplier to take, who is signing the contract, and so on. So having said that, Katharina, if we can maybe move just to the next slide, please. Having said that, it doesn't mean that women are only victims and suffering from energy poverty. Women are also very strong actors. Women are very strong agents of change. Normally we have these gender myths which are saying, oh, women cannot handle things and therefore and victimized and so on and so on. But actually, when it comes to acting against energy poverty, our experience shows that women are very strong in this field. Women have very good way to start with small steps if necessary and slowly work towards bigger change in handling energy. Whereas men, for example, they want to see these big changes such as, I don't know, renovation of a house or a totally new heating system. And this is not something that people affected by energy poverty can easily afford. So that's why women tend to have better agency in this field than men. However, it's really necessary to give better priority to women, to focus on empowering them, to give them voice and so on. But we'll discuss this later. I just maybe wanted to say that in empowerment, which I will also explain a little bit later, it's a project about energy poverty. We are also trying to empower women by using methods such as gender just communication, also respecting women's schedules. We're collecting gender disaggregated data, and we're also respecting gender equality principles when we're designing policies and measures or practical measures in the project. And maybe now, Katharina, back to you for a while. I guess you can switch on to the EGD and gender policies, and then I'll take over again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lidija. This very important point, so the relationship between gender and energy poverty. So now here we are on the European policy level. So the European Green Deal, our flagship for a socially just, sustainable, decarbonized world societies. So don't leave one behind, for example. That's one important motto of the European Green Deal. And so when checking the European Green Deal, so we see that it is completely gender blind, but it's really, it's really a big problem, so not to include it. And here we see, for example, how difficult it seems to be to have coherent policy, because we have the EU gender equality strategy, which is great. And in the European Green Deal as a comprehensive flagship, so it's gender blind and just. So we have overall 8 topics in the European Green Deal, and I just wanted to highlight some of the topics that how important it is to also to have the perspective with a gender lens. For example, the first is, for example, to supply clean, affordable and secure energy. So it's a topic where what Lidija presented is that women have higher vulnerability to energy poverty, for example. The second is the access and the affordability of technologies. So that needs to be included, for example. The second topic is to mobilize the industry and circular economy. So here we see that it's nearly, there is no recognition of reproductive work. So it's not counted, and still the very male-dominated environmental sector, for example, the renewable sector, the mobility sector, etc. So we have the topic of energy efficiency, so the renovation wave. And we have to include and to consider gendered patterns of house tenure and the affordability of technologies, for example, also the access to be able to decide to implement, for example, energy efficiency measures, and also still very male-dominated construction and the energy sector overall. So the mobility sector I already mentioned. So it's super important to know and to include the gendered mobility patterns. So to know the needs of women and men of all gender, and to include that in the planning of the transport sector, for example, and really so to see it's the public sector, the private for the cars, for the individual mobility, for example, but really to see who has which needs, and that this needs to be implemented. And also for agriculture, so we see differences in farming techniques, and overall absolute underrepresentation of women in the agricultural industry and policy making. And for example, for biodiversity and restoring the ecosystem, also some different practices how to increase, how to improve biodiversity. So very easy examples which needs to be included. And and this is a big gap of the European Green Deal, And for example, for the energy sector, for renovation or for renewable energy, so for renovation, so we talk about terms of 20, 30 years to renovate buildings, for example. If we do not include now gender and more justice in the policy, so we reinforce the inequalities for years, and we can't afford to waste the time, to waste the expertise, to waste the justice, for example. And so it's really very important here to include that and to raise awareness. And just to show here are two studies. Here are the links, for example, what we did in cooperation with the European Environmental Bureau on to show the gender gaps of the European Green Deal. And here I again hand over to Lidija on the topic of the European Green Deal and gender poverty and energy poverty.
Thank you, Katharina. As in the previous slide, Katharina showed you two reports, the left one done together with WECF and European Environmental Bureau. We contributed a chapter where we analyzed the European Green Deal from the energy poverty perspective and looked at the nexus of gender and energy poverty again. And we discovered that, first of all, European Green Deal does not include any policies or measures that would be directed into energy poverty gender nexus. So this is definitely a missed field of or a missed opportunity that EGD is still or could still somehow grab in the next step when operationalizing it. The renovation wave strategy does recognize that increasing the role of women in the construction sector could improve the availability of skills and qualified professionals, but there is no further action than that. It's just simply a mention that women could be beneficial in the construction sector, but nothing more happens. So this is a big problem, especially because our analysis shows that the benefits of the EGD are more likely to go in the direction towards men than towards women, definitely when it comes to people affected by energy poverty. First factor is that there is gender gap in ownership and tenure of housing. Namely, men tend to be owners of their dwelling way more often than women. And this means that all the measures and policies that are supportive towards home renovation, towards improving dwellings, so subsidies or favorable loans or whatever means of support there will be, they're basically more beneficial for men because they can actually use these measures from the EGD, whereas women have less access to all these measures and will less likely benefit it. Also, because women tend to be more often tenants, it's less likely that the EGD will be beneficial for them because many voices are warning that renovations are likely to result in having to move away in evictions because people will not be able to afford increased prices of housing and so on. So in this case, also women are more, so to say, are less privileged than men. Then there's the aspect of job creation, namely EGD is promising a lot of new jobs, especially in the construction, renovation and renewable sector. However, this is again jobs that are mainly for healthy men and not other groups so much. And definitely women are disadvantaged again in this process because the job creation is mainly going direction men. There could be some really interesting niches and jobs done by women, like especially in the rising sector of energy communities. Women can play a nice role of energy community managers and so on, but at the moment there are no stimulations or no priorities given to such to creation of such jobs. So probably all in all, it will be again more beneficial for men. And the third aspect that we looked into is the governance of the EGD, and we actually fear that governance is set up in a way that it will simply perpetuate the disadvantaged role of women again, because EGD, although it is at the European level created hopefully a bit more inclusive, it's at the level of operationalization that it's ministries in charge of EGD that are traditionally male-dominated ministries, such as ministries for construction, ministries for infrastructure, ministries of environment, and so on and so on. So again, the women's presence and role will be less visible because simply it's a sector dominated by men. So yeah, this is the analysis. Maybe Katharina, back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Lidija. Yeah, so I think big gaps, a lot needs to be done. So on European level, but now the nice part is here that we see good practice, so we see good examples, and I share with you here some examples on different levels. Of course, we have much more. So, for example, one on policy, it is in Bulgaria, for example. So we for just policy. So in Bulgaria, we see a coherent policy and cooperation between ministries, between the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, Ministry of Energy, and also the Energy and Water Regulation Commission, and with a target to establish a socially just policy for vulnerable consumers to secure the access to energy and water, so to secure the access to basic services. And that's great. And so unfortunately, it's not the case in all countries, but I think that's really good good practice. Second good practice already mentioned by Lidija is also the gender just energy communities. So overall energy communities are in the core or it's the heart of the energy policy of the European Union. I guess you know the Renewable Energy Directive of the European Union, which puts the citizens in the center of the energy supply. And so we see the directives where, for example, renewable energy communities in the countries, they can produce, trade, store, sell energy. And as far as I know, so the transposition in Ireland is pretty good, much better than in other countries, for example, so that is great. And here we have a great instrument for our energy, for a just energy transition. So unfortunately, we see in many countries, so with a long history of energy cooperatives, for example, like Germany and Denmark, that even the very democratic energy cooperatives are very much male-dominated. So, and I think so here we need to really include gender instruments. And for example, Electra Energy in Greece, they have very clear gender targets to have more women in the boards, for example, as members, to have also funding schemes which are more interesting for women. We did as WECF in Georgia, so we implemented gender just energy cooperatives, and overall the European Umbrella Corporation of Energy Cooperatives, RESCOP, where I guess there are also some energy communities in Ireland members. So here we implemented a gender working group. And I think this is also very important that umbrella organizations, they offer support, they do trainings, for example, and instruments for energy communities. So really to use this democratic and social potential what we have for more gender justice. And a very last example, it's a very small and tiny, but so balcony modules, for example, it's just one photovoltaic module. You can use it, you can plug it in, and you can produce energy, you can reduce your energy bill. So it's regulated also in European regulation. So it's allowed in all EU member states. And here we see some energy companies and energy cooperatives in Germany. For example, they do targeted trainings for women and girls to use, for example, balcony modules. And so here, and I think there are, and maybe I mention one more point, because as WECF, we are also very much engaged in the women and gender constituency of the UNFCCC on UN level for the climate negotiations, and we so in the Women and Gender Constituency organizes annually in the frame of the climate conference Gender Just Climate Solutions, and organizations, ideas and initiatives all over the world, they apply and they are awarded in the frame of the conference. And here we see a lot of gender just solutions, and it's very important to upscale the ideas, to make them visible, and also to have funding schemes for such projects. And one good practice is the Empower Mid project, now presented by Lidija.
Thank you, Katharina. Yeah, so mentioned already several times, but now finally presented. It's a Horizon 2020 supported project, which started in September 2019. And we're trying to contribute to alleviation of energy poverty and improvement of health among people affected by energy poverty in the Mediterranean countries. We focus on women in the project, and we want to do that because, as I mentioned before, women are strong actors in tackling energy poverty. We're trying to implement practical solutions, but we're also trying to see how these solutions work in practice, and then form policy recommendations on how best to tackle energy poverty in the future within the Mediterranean context. If we can move to the next slide, Katharina, please. Then here are our core activities. We've so far mobilized the local key actors. We also had several capacity building events and activities done. And right now we're in a phase where we're implementing practical solutions. We're doing 5 different types, actually not only 4 like in the slide, but 5. One is the household visits. So we visit people affected by energy poverty, and we do a very simple energy audit, and we provide custom-made tips and also a package of devices that can help people save some energy, or at least improve well-being in case when energy cannot be saved because people are already underusing or using too little energy and feeling uncomfortable because of that. Then we're doing collective assemblies. The concept of collective assembly is that about every 2 weeks, we gather a group of people affected by energy poverty in some place. It can be a public place, or sometimes when we are linked to some existing groups in their own premises. And actually the group of people works as a peer-to-peer help to each other to alleviate energy poverty. For example, they help each other in changing energy suppliers towards a cheaper one, or they help each other when they have piled up debts towards energy suppliers and are looking for ways how to avoid those debts, and so on. So the idea is that people really kind of work with each other and empower each other. Of course, we also are there. We sometimes accompany people to the companies. If necessary, we also sometimes help them fight with the companies. But in principle, we try to empower them and make it sure that they can help each other in getting out of energy poverty, at least partially. We also do it-yourself activities. Mainly it's workshops where people learn how to do some very basic measures, such as shading their house or flat properly, or putting very simple insulation in windows so that they are not leaking cold air, and so on. Some part of the do-it-yourself activities is also oriented towards reading of smart meters. Namely, in quite some parts of Europe, smart meters are becoming a normal thing, even or also in the households affected by energy poverty, and people can actually learn a lot from knowing how to read smart meter. So we're working with households to learn how to see your consumption, your behavior from the smart meter, and learn from it to reduce your energy consumption and improve your well-being. Last thing, one before last thing that we do is health workshops. In Barcelona, for example, the health workshops are related directly with people affected by energy poverty, together with therapists, where they're working in groups to avoid or to at least reduce their distress because of energy poverty, such as anxieties because of not being able to pay bills, or depressions because of being in debt, and so on. In other countries, we do workshops for frontline staff, such as nurses or social workers that are visiting people in their homes, and equipping these frontline workers with some basic information about energy poverty and how they can do first aid. What we also do in all countries is help people access financial programs, so subsidies or favorable loans that are for people affected by energy poverty, but sometimes they're scared to access them because it's too difficult to fill in the documentation and so on and so on. After this phase is finished, we're gonna go on to advocacy work, where we're gonna promote some systemic measures against energy poverty and work with decision makers and key policy actors to ensure that systemic measures come to place to tackle energy poverty, not just small measures like we're doing in the project. And the last slide, I think we just list the countries, which are Spain, France, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, and Albania. That's where the pilots are. And of course, we have a German partner, WECF, Katharina, and her colleague Anke, that are doing the cross-cutting gender issue coverage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lidija and Katharina, for sharing your work and your expertise, but also your personal experiences as well. And thank you to those for joining us during this time. There's a few ways to support gender justice today in Ireland, for instance, joining or starting a gender justice group in your community to support political agency of women, or speaking out against patriarchal and oppressive behaviour, and supporting anti-racist and anti-capitalist grassroots feminist movements happening locally and globally. And continually, of course, learning more about these issues is so important. So I'm going to share some more resources on a feminist Green Deal and other gender justice learning materials in the chat now, and they'll be attached to this recording as well. So thank you so much to Lidija, to Katharina, and for our participants today. I'll see some of you later on for our next evening session, and hopefully I'll see some of you at the rally tomorrow as well. Thank you so much, and goodbye.